Hello and welcome back to Fullerton College's Print 75 and 77F Combined Pre-Press Lecture. This is your professor, Ben Hewitt, and we're picking up on part 2 of my series on the PIA's Pre-Press Training Manual, Chapter 2.6, which is all about the PDF and Adobe Acrobat. So let's take a look more at this. Where we last left our hero, we were talking about the fact that it's a container file, or a meta file, which sounds way, way cooler. And this container file contains vector objects, raster objects, and text objects all in one convenient file, while also not being any of these file formats. It contains them, which makes it the perfect contained system to send out to final output. So here's the software family. There is the Reader, which is free, and you should get one if you don't have one. Acrobat, which if you have the Creative Cloud installed and you have an account going, you will have access to, which is a very powerful tool. And one of the best things it can do is check files for errors, by the way. It does lots of other things too, as noted on the screen and in your books. And then there's Distiller, which you all already have, you just don't know it. Because Distiller is how you create PDFs without Acrobat or the Creative Suite. Sorry, it's a cloud now, Creative Cloud. If you don't have Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator, or Acrobat, you're using Distiller when you make a PDF. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then later on we'll talk a lot more about that. The Reader just lets anybody open a PDF. PDFs are not native to any system, and they're not native to internet, which is my one gripe, is that you have to download them to view them online. You can't just embed them in a web page because of how the coding works. Oh well. But anyways, Reader lets anybody anywhere open and look at, and even print. Even you can use Reader to do a high quality actual press output, and it works just fine. Reader translates the PDF back into visual material so you, the human, can look at the coding, well, not the coding, but the results of the coding, and see the awesome design, the pretty picture, whatever else, the office memo that it was. Acrobat Professional lets you create your own PDFs from scratch if you want to. I don't recommend it for print applications. That's not a good way to do it. But if you're making an online form that needs to be filled out, like a contract or something that people are signing by typing things into forms and sending them back, then actually Acrobat's not the worst place to do that, because you can do that sort of thing there. I like Acrobat for its pre-flight options and the ability to go through and check for errors and mistakes in a PDF that's been output. You can check image resolutions, you can check for missing fonts and all sorts of things. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's its own chapter. Distiller. Distiller exists inside your operating system, and it helps other programs and other applications be able to generate PDFs, even though it's not their native function. If you say save as PDF in Microsoft Word or the Apple version Pages, or if you're in a web browser, you say save as PDF, or any other place other than the Adobe Creative Suite, Cloud, sorry guys, I am old. But remember, there is no such thing as the cloud. It's only somebody else's computer. Just thought I'd put that out there. So the Distiller says, convert the postscript I was going to print and, distill it. Like you're distilling a, we'll just say water at this point because it's cleaner and a little more nice than the other things that get distilled in the backwoods of the Appalachian Mountains. And there's less banjos involved in distilling water. But anyways, a distiller says, take the information that I was going to make into a printed page on my little home printer here, but instead save that postscript and convert it back into a PDF that can be saved on the computer. So let's talk about why they're cool and why we like them. PDFs are platform independent. It does not matter if you're running a Windows machine, a Macintosh machine, a Linux machine. Of course, all three are pretty similar these days. Anyways, this used to be a bigger deal, I swear. Or any other random home-cooked, home-brewed operating system that you might be operating in. The PDF will work on your system. When I was younger and growing up, the PDF was unbelievably cool to be able to be opened on a Mac or a Windows PC. You guys have no idea how big a deal that is. I mean, they still have trouble running games on both systems, and you have to have a different version of Photoshop to open on both of them because the background language being used to define these operating systems is so vastly different from each other. Not as vast, now that we both just basically stolen Linux, but still. It was really hard to get anything to open. You couldn't open text files from one to another, let alone pictures, let alone output print files that work on both? That is just unheard of. Why would you even talk such crazy talk? The PDFs can do that. PDFs are reliable. Let me say more reliable. I mean, all data can have problems. Any sort of save file on a computer can get corrupted and not open correctly and have problems and lose data. Most of the time, that's a function of either how it was stored or how it was transmitted. Maybe the flash drive it was on had problems. I've seen that happen cripplingly to students at the wrong time, and it always sucks. And it's happened to me too. Also, file transfer, like emailing it or sending it across a network, just like transporter problems make up half the plot line of Star Trek, so do email problems make up half the plot line of trying to get something to print correctly. There's always some data that doesn't quite transfer properly across the phone lines and the infrastructure and the world around us. So, but they're reliable. Other than those problems, they work really well. Remember that unlike Microsoft Word documents, which every time you open it on a new computer decides to reinvent itself and reinterpret its meaning and go on a voyage of self-discovery where it figures out where it wants to put your pictures and your text and how big the font really wants to be and if it's the same version of the font or not. So the fact that PDFs open the same way on every computer, it sounds so simple, but my gosh, was it hard to make that happen. It's a wonderful thing about being reliable on them. They're compact because they were meant for interoffice memos on very, very early, very shaky networks. They don't have a lot of extra memory needed to store them. They're able to very streamlinedly, very smoothly contain a lot of good information in a very small file. They're unfairly good, actually. They're self-contained. This is wonderful too. They take with them the fonts that you need, the graphics that you need, and all the things that someone else would need to be able to open and view it / print it. It's all inside that same meta file box. It is wonderful. And they can be repurposed. You can take a PDF that was generated for printing and you can downsample it and make it a online viewable one. You can take a PDF of a form you've made that you're going to print thousands of copies of and say, but I'd like an online version where someone could type in their responses instead. And you can do that to a PDF. You can say, well, let's make it fillable. It has a lot of post editing. And if you created a PDF in Illustrator, oh my gosh, the conversion from AI to PDF is one of the smoothest, most seamless things I've ever seen on a computer. The fact is, if you make it there, you can take it back there and edit it as though it was a native AI file with very few differences and very few qualifications of, well, actually. There's not a lot of well, actually. It's pretty much just as good. Also, you can take PDFs made somewhere else and you can open them up in Acrobat to make a few changes. I'll show you that sometime. It doesn't always work. It's a little bit of a risky surgery, but sometimes that's how you fix a file for print when someone built it wrongly and you need to fix it. AI is actually an interesting backdoor into fixing PDFs. Cross-platform capability, we already talked about this. It's, I guess I probably talked in too much detail in that last slide. The PDF opens on everything. And that is unbelievably cool. You guys might take it for granted that you can open up a JPEG on any computer these days, and a lot of text files are passable. They didn't used to be. Back in the days of the Apple II and the Commodore 64, there was no way you could take a 5-inch floppy from any of those and drop it into another one and expect it to work. They've come a little bit closer together, but still, the fact that a PDF can open anywhere is a really good thing. Reliability. It's also very WYSIWYG. What you see on the monitor is what prints. It doesn't have to translate and figure out what's going on later on because remember, it's built out of printer language. The coding, the hard coding, I guess it's not hard, but the thinking brains code of a printer or a plate maker or any sort of output raster imaging device is the same language that the PDF is built out of. So it's going to describe graphics accurately and stably. There's my mouse. There's smaller file sizes. If you use an original file from InDesign or Illustrator, you can see that it's much larger. When you output down to just a PDF, it really streamlines it to printing. Sometimes it involves some downsampling. Sometimes your images will be used at the resolution necessary to print and not the original. It'll make everything just small enough to work. But it's wonderful because it transfers so fast on networks. What made them good in the early days of interoffice memos and, Bigsby, see me in my office, still works today in the age of sending them across networks or even emailing to people to print. Because they're smaller, they're faster, and they're more efficient. And that saves processing time and that saves transfer time. It is actually a big deal. PDFs make a lot of stuff go a lot smoother. They're self-contained. They have the fonts that you need embedded in them. They have the other things that you need embedded in them, like the images, like the graphics, like the vectors. It's all put into the same file. If any of you have gone through 101 on our campus and have tried using an EPS, which is what is preferred on some of the older systems, to use one of our more dated plate making systems, which is a good exercise just to understand the problem actually, you'll find out that if you didn't include, even though you gave it the EPS, which supposedly has your fonts and your pictures and everything in it, if you don't include those in the same folder when you upload to the Rampage output plate maker, it will crash and not be able to do it because it needs your fonts and it needs your images. PDF does not have that problem. By being self-contained, anywhere you send a PDF has everything necessary to print it accurately, which is really, really great. And by embedding fonts, one of the most common problems you'll get from people's files being sent to you is missing fonts. And PDFs almost never have missing fonts unless someone really screwed something up on their end, which, you know, is not unheard of. For document repurposing, the fact that you can resize them, they don't stick themselves at one resolution. They have compression algorithms to compress images to make them smaller, but it doesn't mean that they have to live at that resolution. You can reuse them from high-end printing down to internet distribution to emailing them out for people to read a flyer on the computer. It is all doable. CD-ROM. Yeah, that one didn't pan out, did it? PostScript interpreters. Remember that they are made using PostScript data. So things like desktop publishing programs, like your Bad Llama, like your Quark Express and your InDesign, and to a lesser extent CorelDRAW, can print as a PostScript and then distill back to a PDF. Now, I don't like this chart here because InDesign, even back in CS4 days, was able to skip this step. But you're able to print to PostScript and then convert that PostScript back to a PDF. So a lot of applications do this. It takes the PostScript that would have been sent to a printer and it says, wait, let's just capture it like that and save that. Direct export is the way to go. Whenever possible, direct export. And one of the leg ups that Adobe products have is they can do this better because they invented the PDF. So they have a much more thorough, well, rights, but also knowledge of how to do this. So there is no PostScript step. You can take a file in InDesign and you can take that file and directly just say, become a PDF, and it does. And it's a much cleaner PDF with less issues. Plus, without the PostScript step, things like vectors, gradients, some of the transparency-based effects are preserved at a higher resolution, which means it will print much, much cleaner. So if you did a lot of vector images, you have some beautiful vector logos or some transparency effects that you've thrown onto things and you use a PostScript, it's going to downsample that to 600 dots per inch or so, which sounds great. It's definitely above the 300 dots that's necessary for printing for photos. But in order for a vector to look good, you want at least 1200 dots per inch. You need a much smaller dot size and much more dots to get a clean looking line. Anyways, a direct export preserves it in a way that will show that line as clear as possible. Then whenever you print it on, it will print at that resolution. Basically, if you convert to PostScript before you convert to PDF, you use that PostScript intermediate step, you are losing a lot of the advantages of using vector images. And don't forget what we already learned, fonts are also vector information. So the type itself will look clearer and crisper if you're able to do a direct export. Operating systems can do that too. The distiller is built into Mac OS and built into Windows. And anytime you want to save as a PDF through anything, it can do this. It will all take whatever you've made and convert to PostScript and convert back over to PDF. And you definitely lose your vectors if you do it this way. And spot colors and ICC profiles and all the higher end tags that you want to pass through, they're going to help a proper output show up, are not going to be present here. So it can do it, but it's not as good. The upside is this is still better than getting native Word files sent to you. So if you have clients who insist on or can't afford to use the good stuff, I'm working on more primitive systems, they can still give you a PDF. And even a PDF made in suboptimal conditions is better than not using a PDF. All right, looks like we did it in only 2 videos. Hooray!